video is serving as a supplement if you're not able to be in person as we watch how to use the table saw. We still want you to ask questions when you're in class because seeing somebody demonstrate this for you is really powerful. So please don't think that after we watch this video, we can cut away without any instruction from the teacher. A couple things that I have done for this video is one, move the guard out of the way. And I'll show you how to do that right now. To remove the guard on the table saw, unclick this lever. Now the guard is able to swing free from the table saw. We're only moving the guard out of the way so that we can see the blade and some of the adjustments that need to be made before we make our cut. We would never use the table saw without the blade guard in place. Second thing that I've done is I've got my safety glasses on. We never want to operate the table saw without our safety glasses. There's a lot of debris that can come flying back at us. The guard does help prevent some of that, but it's not going to stop all of it. Formatting of the paper got a little bit goofed up when I submitted it onto Canvas, so we're going to do number 2 first, which is actually number 1. Number 2 says, the formatting of the paper got a little bit goofed up when I submitted it onto Canvas, so we're going to do number 2 first, which is actually number 1. Number 2 says the smallest board that can be cut without a push stick is 3 inches wide. We always want to have a push stick within hand's reach when we're using the table saw, so we're not trying to hold a board and reach some distance to grab it. Table saw, so we're not trying to hold a board and reach some distance to grab it. The 3 inches is the distance between the blade and the fence. So I'm going to set that at 3 inches. If I've got 3 inches or less, I've got to use a push stick. And when you're first learning to use the table saw, if you want to use the push stick for a little bit wider piece, that is totally fine with me. Number 2, which is actually number 1, says the blade of the table saw must not be more than 3/4 of an inch above the piece of wood. So if I'm looking here, I've got my piece of wood and I've got the blade. 3/4 of an inch is an approximation. We're not going to get a tape measure out and measure that. Well, a good rule of thumb is that on a table saw blade, there are teeth. The space between the teeth is about 3/4 of an inch from the top of the blade. Now that'll vary with blade, but that's a pretty good rule of thumb. If it's out of adjustment, let's say I'm cutting a 1/4 inch thick piece of wood, that's way more than 3/4 of an inch. There's an adjusting wheel right in front of our knees that we can bring down so the blade is at the correct height. But we're mostly going to be cutting 3/4 inch material, so I'm going to leave this about right there. Number 3, the shortest board that can be cut on the table saw is 10 inches long. That means the distance from here to here has got to be greater than 10 inches. If it's shorter than 10 inches, we've got a better chance of the blade not engaging with the splitter and kicking the board back. Number 4, cutting with the grain of the wood is called ripping. All wood's got grain. Some different species, that grain is really easy to see, and some it's very difficult to see. But on red oak, that grain is generally moving up and down. When we're making the board narrower, it means we're cutting with the grain, and that's often called ripping. Number 5, cutting across the grain is called crosscutting. Now, we typically aren't going to do that on the table saw. About 95% of all of our crosscuts are going to happen on the miter saw, which we'll learn tomorrow. Number 6, always stand to the side, the left side of the blade, when the material is being cut. It's the safest place to stand in the event of a kickback. I always like to line up my right shoulder with the blade. That way, if I am cutting a board and it catches the blade and kicks back, it's either going to miss me or it's going to glance off my hip or my thigh, not some more sensitive parts. Number 7, the right thumb should always be tucked in. We always want to have that right thumb, so let's say I'm cutting this board. That right thumb, I've seen a lot of students do this and cut, but that thumb is sticking out and it's very easy to slip off into the blade. That right thumb should be pointing straight down, tucked in like this. We just don't want it sticking out too far because it's real likely to get nipped by the blade. Number 8 is the most common time when people get hurt. It says never remove scraps of wood from near the blade when the blade is running. So if I just made a cut and this is my extra piece, I want to make sure that that blade has stopped before I reach in and take this board out. If that blade is still spinning, I run the risk of hurting myself, and the blade takes about 10 seconds to stop after you turn the power off. It's well worth the wait. Number 9, never use a miter gauge and a fence at the same time. This is a miter gauge, and it's often kept right here. A miter gauge is used for cutting miters, kind of like the miter saw. The table saw can do it, but it's not as good at doing it as the miter saw is. But if you are going to use a miter gauge to cross-cut a piece of wood, please ask. Don't just start doing this. I want to look, though, at what happens when I use a miter gauge and the fence at the same time. So I've got the fence set at 6 inches because I want to cut a 6-inch board. If I use the fence and the miter gauge at the same time, this board is going to get trapped in between the fence and the blade, and it could likely go flying back at me. So we never want to use the fence and miter gauge at the same time. So what I'll do is I'll slide the fence down, and now if I want to make my cut, that's just fine, because it's not going to get pinched in between the blade and the fence. Number 10, when using the miter gauge, never return the board past the blade after the cut has been made. So if I did make a cut with the miter gauge, I make the cut and I get the blade out of the way. I don't make the cut and then bring it back. In a video you'll see in just a little bit, when we bring that board back, it could catch a tooth on the table saw blade and throw it back at us. We always want to be moving the opposite direction that the blade is spinning, so we're not getting into any issues with that blade taking our board and throwing it back at us. Number 11 says never use a table saw without the guard. Ask the instructor if you feel the blade must be moved. We've moved it for the purposes of this demonstration, but when I start cutting boards, I will bring that back. Number 13 has to do with the insides of the saw. Inside of the table saw, there is an arbor that looks like this. It's basically a bolt sticking out that our blade sticks onto. Now that blade, or that bolt, has threads that spin backwards. They're left-handed. So it's not the righty-tighty, lefty-loosey like we're used to. The threads spin backwards. That's because when this machine turns on, it goes from 0 to about 5,000 RPMs almost instantly, and that's a lot of force that it puts on that nut. We want to make sure when we turn the saw blade on that it's tightening that nut instead of loosening it. Otherwise, someday the blade's going to come off because that nut will fall off with all the starts and stops that the blade has to make. So that table saw arbor blade has left-handed threads, which is backwards from normal. If you're ever changing the blade and you've realized that this is really hard to do, you're probably turning it backwards. Number 14, the riving knife, that's this piece, or the splitter, should always be used. It's what helps prevent kickbacks. This might be a little bit harder or challenging for you to see, but this often happens with people that are a little timid to use the table saw. They'll use their hand, but they'll get so far away that as they're pushing, and you may not be able to see this, but as I'm pushing right here, it creates quite a space between the fence and the board. Now, this splitter right here, though, prevents the board from getting on top of the saw blade. The saw blade spins towards me, towards the saw operator, and if the back tooth touches that blade, that board, it flips it back at me. So the splitter prevents that from happening. So if we didn't have a splitter in, and we can take it out, now when I push the board and it comes away from the fence, the back of the board gets hit by this tooth, and that board is coming flying back at me, and it's going to come fast. You'll see a kickback on camera at the very end of this video, at the end of this demo, that'll make you think twice about cutting without a splitter in. Number 15, a kickback happens when the board comes away from the fence on the table saw. The material catches the blade and is thrown back at the saw operator, like we just said. Number 16, when helping a partner cut on the table saw, the helper should never grab or pull the board. The only role of the helper is to support the board. So let's pretend I'm standing on the outfeed side of the table saw and I'm cutting a really long piece of wood. As I'm cutting this long piece of wood, it's going to want to tip up on me. So that saw helper is just supporting the board so it can't tip up on the saw operator. Really important they don't grab or pull the board. They're just holding it so it doesn't tip up on the saw operator. Number 17 has to do with dados and rabbets, and that's the table saw that's in the back of the shop. It's set up exactly the same. The only difference is we put 4 or 5 blades in at a time, and we cut grooves into our board. We don't cut all the way through it. We cut grooves that slide into each other, called a dado or a rabbet. When we're cutting those grooves, we're not cutting all the way through the board. And even if I'm not cutting all the way through the board, I don't want to have my hand on top of where that blade is going to be, because if that board does get kicked back, my hand is going right into the blade. And 18, it's dangerous to pull stock through the table saw or any other machine. All of our machines in our shop are set up for us to push the boards through them, not pull through them. And the last one has to do with the direction of the teeth in the table saw, is that the teeth always face towards the in-feed table. That's where the saw operator stands. So in-feed is here, out-feed is over there, and side feed is on my left-hand side as we're using the saw.